welcome to our deep dive.
I'm excited to be here.
You know, you sent over some really interesting excerpts from Rich Dad, Poor Dad
Oh, yeah.
by Robert Kiyosaki. It's the 20th anniversary edition.
Wow, 20 years.
It really got me thinking, like, how much of his advice still holds true today, you know? Especially in a world that's changed so much since '97.
Yeah, because his take on money was kind of a bombshell back then.
It really was, right?
Like, everyone thought you get a good education, you're set for life. But Kiyosaki, he kind of flipped that on its head.
Yeah, he was ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. So we're going to dive into some of the book's big takeaways, and what's more important, we'll see how those lessons actually apply to you and your finances right now.
Sounds good.
For example, one of his most famous and most debated ideas was that your house is not an asset.
Oh, yeah. That's the one that got people talking, especially after 2008, when the housing market crashed.
Right, it was like his point was proven. Because a lot of people saw their so-called asset just like plummet in value. But he was always adamant about that distinction between an asset and a liability. An asset puts money in your pocket.
Yeah.
But a liability takes it out. So when you think about your house, is it putting money in your pocket or taking it out?
It's a good question to think about. Like, owning a home, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But if all you're doing is pouring money into mortgage payments and property taxes and repairs, is it really making you money?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just draining your resources?
It's such a good way to think about it. And it all ties back into another huge idea from Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yeah.
And that is that the rich don't work for money, they make their money work for them.
Yeah.
I love the story about, like, 9-year-old Robert working for his rich dad.
Oh, yeah.
For pennies.
Pennies, yeah.
Learning the value of business at such a young age and, delayed gratification.
It wasn't about the pennies. It
Yeah.
was about learning that mindset. How do you build assets that actually make money even when you're sleeping?
Yeah, passively. And speaking of, that leads us to Kiyosaki's cash flow quadrant. Give us a breakdown. What is that?
Okay, so it's a model, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it categorizes people based on how they get their income.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got your employees, the E quadrant. They're trading their time for a paycheck.
Yep.
Then you've got the self-employed, the S quadrant. They're usually highly skilled, but they're still trading their time for money.
Okay.
Now, on the flip side, you've got the B quadrant, the business owners. They create systems that work for them.
Okay.
And then you've got the I quadrant, the investors. They're making money from their assets.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Rich Dad really pushed young Robert towards those B and I quadrants.
Absolutely. The idea is to build real wealth, you need to shift from working for money to having your money work for it all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about being rich. It's about having the freedom to, design the life you want.
Exactly.
Have the flexibility.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about assets versus liabilities. We've talked about understanding that cash flow quadrant.
Yep.
Making your money work for you. It all sounds great in theory, but Kiyosaki also points out that, the system isn't always fair,
Yeah.
especially when you're talking about taxes.
Right.
He argues that, often the middle class ends up paying the biggest percentage of their income in taxes, while the wealthy are able to, legally minimize theirs.
Oh, yeah. That always gets people fired up.
It does. It's a hot topic.
Yeah.
But agree or disagree with his assessment, you can't deny that understanding tax laws, that's crucial for building wealth, right?
Absolutely. And Kiyosaki, he even gives a little history lesson on income taxes.
Does he?
Yeah. They started as something temporary, during wartime, but then they became a permanent fixture. He's really emphasizing that knowledge is power when it comes to the tax system.
So it's not just about knowing how to earn money, it's about knowing how to keep it and how to make it grow. And I think a lot of people, they kind of put off learning about personal finance because it feels intimidating.
Yeah.
Or boring.
Right.
But Kiyosaki says that financial literacy, that's empowering.
It is.
When you understand how money works,
Yeah.
you have more control of your life.
You do.
Now, even with the right knowledge, Kiyosaki says there are still obstacles that can trip people up.
Right.
He lists 5.
5, yeah.
Fear, cynicism, laziness, bad habits, and arrogance.
Okay.
And he uses that analogy of the Chicken Littles,
Oh, right.
always thinking the sky is falling,
Yeah.
missing out on opportunities because they're so afraid of losing money. He argues that fear, yeah, it's normal, it's human, but it can really hold you back if you let it take control.
Totally. And you see it all the time, right?
We do, right?
People who are so scared of losing money that they just keep all their savings in a low-yield account.
Yeah.
instead of, exploring investments that could help them grow their wealth.
Yeah.
And fear, it can lead to procrastination too.
Oh, absolutely.
People put off those important financial decisions. They're just afraid of making the wrong choice. They get stuck, like overthinking everything.
Oh, for sure. And
Yeah.
then they say they're too busy to manage their finances
Yeah.
when really they're just letting life pass them by.
Yeah. That busy excuse, classic laziness, Kiyosaki says.
He's not afraid to call it out, is he?
No, he's not. He's saying that people who are serious about financial freedom, they'll make time for it, even if they have to sacrifice some leisure time or cut back on things they don't really need.
Right, you've got to prioritize.
You do.
And he also connects laziness to a lack of curiosity.
Uh-huh.
That resistance to learning new things.
Yeah, and that's where that commitment to, lifelong learning comes in, whether it's reading books or going to seminars or listening to podcasts like this one or connecting with mentors. You
Right.
got to keep growing that knowledge and those skills.
Yeah, you've got to stay ahead of the curves because the world's changing so fast. If you're not constantly learning, you're going to get left behind.
That's a great point. And I see this a lot, actually. A specific kind of laziness. People just delegate all their financial decisions to someone else.
You mean like they just blindly follow their financial advisor's advice without really understanding what's going on?
Exactly. And look, it's good to have trusted advisors, but you should never give up complete control over your finances.
It's your money,
Yeah.
your future.
That's right. It's your responsibility. And that takes us to bad habits, which can be just as bad as being lazy. Kiyosaki talks about how those small financial choices we make, they can add up to big expenses over time.
Yeah, he used the example of like buying a latte every day
Oh, right.
or eating out all the time.
That's it. The classic death by a thousand cuts, he calls it. You might not even think about those small expenses individually, but over time, they can drain your bank account without adding anything meaningful to your life.
And those little leaks are everywhere now.
They are. Online shopping, subscription services. It's so easy to click buy now and then forget about it. But all those recurring charges, they add up.
They do, yeah. So Kiyosaki stresses developing good habits, like tracking your spending, creating a budget, automating your savings.
Oh, exactly.
Creating systems that actually support your goals.
Yeah, instead of working against you. And that takes discipline.
It does.
But it's a muscle you can build. And the reward is worth it.
Okay, so we've talked about fear, laziness, bad habits. Let's hit that last obstacle Kiyosaki talks about, arrogance. He basically warns against thinking you know it all.
Yeah, like don't confuse knowledge with wisdom.
Right. You can have all the facts and figures in the world, but if you're not humble enough to admit when you're wrong or to seek out different perspectives, you're going to make mistakes.
Costly ones.
Costly ones, yeah. He says no one has all the answers.
And you see that arrogance a lot in investing. People have a few good investments, make some money, and they start to think they're invincible, which can lead to, some really bad decisions.
They get overconfident. And they forget that every investment has some risk. And no one can predict the market perfectly.
Exactly. So even when you're winning, stay grounded, stay informed, and always be willing to learn from your mistakes.
So in this first part of our deep dive, we've explored Kiyosaki's core message about financial literacy.
Yeah.
The importance of knowing the difference between an asset and a liability,
Right.
and those 5 obstacles that can get in our way.
5.
But this is just the beginning. In the next part, we're going to dig even deeper into Kiyosaki's ideas and see how they connect to your specific situation. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad. We were just talking about those 5 obstacles, remember?
Yeah.
The ones that Kiyosaki says can trip us up on our financial journeys, like fear, cynicism, laziness, bad habits, and arrogance. Think about them now. Which ones feel like they're especially relevant today?
Well, they all kind of resonate, don't they? But I think the way they show up, the way they affect us, that's been supercharged by social media and, the 24-hour news cycle.
It's true, right? It's like we're constantly bombarded with stuff that just feeds our fears and our cynicism. Always some crisis on the horizon.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or the market's about to crash. It's hard to just tune it out.
And then you add in that social media comparison game,
Oh, yeah.
which just fuels that whole I can't afford that mentality.
Kiyosaki talks about that, right?
He does. It's so easy to get caught up in wanting what everyone else has, even if you have to go into debt to get it.
It's like that rat race he talks about. You're working harder and harder just to keep up.
Exactly.
I think a lot of people, no matter how much money they make, They feel that, like they're stuck on a treadmill.
It's a trap that's easy to fall into, especially if you haven't really grasped the difference between an asset and a liability. We're just conditioned to think that a bigger house, a nicer car, the latest gadgets, that's what success looks like. But those are often the very things, the liabilities, that keep us stuck in that race.
Because they're not generating income, they're costing you money. So you end up working for your stuff.
Exactly, instead of your stuff working for you.
And that's why I think his advice to mind your own business, that's so important.
It is.
He doesn't mean literally quit your job tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
It's more about cultivating that mindset, that entrepreneurial way of thinking.
Exactly.
So side hustles, investments, building multiple streams of income.
Yeah, creating your own opportunities instead of relying on just that single paycheck. But of course, that takes a certain level of, financial know-how. You got to understand how to manage cash flow, how to evaluate those investments, and how to deal with taxes.
Which brings us back to that idea of, lifelong learning. You got to keep learning. I was rereading the 20th anniversary edition, and something that stood out to me was the section on overcoming fear.
Mm.
He talks about how, fear can paralyze us, but it can also be a motivator.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah, I thought so too. It's like that saying, fear can motivate you or it can poison you. Something like that.
Yeah, totally. So how does he say we can use that fear to our advantage?
Well, he says when you're really afraid of something, you'll do anything to avoid it.
That makes sense.
So if you're really terrified of ending up broke, for example, that fear could actually push you to get your finances in order.
Right.
It's about flipping that fear,
Yeah.
using it as fuel.
Yeah, it's not about pretending you're not afraid.
Right.
It's about channeling it into something positive.
And I think that connects to overcoming cynicism too, When you're focused on your long-term goals, you're less likely to get caught up in the negative stuff.
Absolutely. Kiyosaki talks about those chicken littles we mentioned earlier, always predicting doom and gloom.
Yeah.
He says true investors, they see opportunity when others see crisis.
Oh, interesting.
They're not afraid to buy when everyone else is selling because they know markets go up and down.
So you got to have that long-term vision
Right.
and not let the short-term ups and downs shake you. And that's something you can learn
Right.
over time.
Absolutely. And it's not just about market stuff, it's also about being open to new ideas in general. Because cynicism, it can make you resist change.
Yeah, Kiyosaki talks about that. People who cling to outdated ideas about money, they often end up struggling because the world's changing and they're not changing with it.
It's like trying to use a map from 100 years ago to navigate today's world. Things are different now.
Okay, so we've talked about fear, cynicism. Now, what about laziness? We all struggle with that, right?
We do. And Kiyosaki, he doesn't accept the I'm too busy excuse.
Oh, no, he doesn't.
He says if you're truly committed to achieving financial freedom, you will make time for it.
Even if you're busy, even if you have a family.
Exactly. He also talks about laziness showing up as a lack of curiosity.
Right.
Like not wanting to learn new things.
And that's where that commitment to lifelong learning comes in.
It does. Reading books, going to seminars, listening to podcasts, finding mentors.
Yeah.
You got to keep learning and growing.
You got to keep up because things are moving so fast.
They are. And one type of laziness I see a lot, it's the tendency to just let someone else handle all your money decisions.
You mean like blindly following your financial advisor?
Exactly. Now, advisors can be great, but you should never completely give up control of your own finances.
It's your money, your future.
It is, you're right. It's your responsibility. And that takes us to bad habits, which can be just as damaging as laziness.
Okay.
Kiyosaki points out how those seemingly small financial choices, they can add up over time.
He talks about the latte factor, right?
He does. The daily latte, eating out all the time, that death by 1,000 cuts idea.
Yeah.
You don't even notice those small expenses individually, but they add up, and they don't really add any value to your life.
And they're everywhere, right? Online shopping, subscriptions. So easy to just click and spend without thinking about it.
It is. So Kiyosaki stresses the importance of good habits.
Like tracking your spending, making a budget.
Exactly. Automating your savings. Putting systems in place that work for you instead of against you. And that takes discipline,
I know.
But like we said, it's a muscle you can build.
All right, so we've covered fear, laziness, cynicism, bad habits. Let's talk about that last obstacle. Arrogance.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, Don't confuse knowledge with wisdom.
Right. You can know a lot of stuff, but if you're not humble enough to admit you're wrong sometimes
Yeah.
or to listen to other people's perspectives, you're going to make mistakes.
Expensive mistakes.
Exactly. And no one has all the answers, right?
Right.
And in investing, that arrogance often shows up as overconfidence. Someone makes a few good investments, they start thinking they're invincible. And that's when they make bad choices.
Because they get cocky and forget that there's always risk involved.
Always. No one can predict the market perfectly, right? So even when you're on a roll, you got to stay grounded, stay informed, and be willing to learn from those mistakes.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to hear from you, our listeners. Which of these obstacles do you relate to the most? What strategies have you used to overcome them? We're all in this together, and we can learn from each other's experiences. Welcome back to our deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Glad to be back.
We've covered so much of Kiyosaki's wisdom already, haven't we? Like understanding those all-important assets and liabilities, and then all those obstacles that can hold us back.
Yeah, there's 5 big ones.
But there's one more powerful idea from the book that we need to unpack before we wrap up.
Definitely, it's a good one. Work to learn, not just for money.
It's so easy, especially when you're just starting out, to be laser focused on that paycheck.
Yeah.
You know, you got to pay the bills, you want to save a little, maybe have some fun.
Right. But Kiyosaki, he wants us to look beyond that, to see the bigger picture. He says we should view every job as a chance to learn valuable skills that will help us down the road.
It's like you're building your own personal knowledge bank, your own expertise.
Exactly. And that knowledge, those skills, nobody can take those away from you.
It's the foundation for better opportunities in the future. Earning more money, ultimately that financial freedom we're all after.
There's this story in the book that illustrates this perfectly. Kiyosaki talks about this really talented journalist.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And despite his talent, the guy was struggling financially.
Why? Because he didn't have any business sense.
That's it exactly. He was a brilliant writer, a fantastic reporter, but he didn't know the first thing about managing money or marketing his skills or negotiating. So even though he was great at what he did, he couldn't really get ahead.
It's a good reminder that you got to have a well-rounded skill set, right? It's not enough to just be good at one thing. You got to have those business skills to back it up.
Kiyosaki, he really hammers home that point. No matter what your profession, you need to develop skills in sales, marketing, and financial management.
Because those are the skills that let you create your own opportunities, build relationships, and ultimately, turn your talents into financial success.
Yeah, they're like your secret weapons. And it all goes back to minding your own business, like we talked about.
Right. Even if you're not running your own company, having that entrepreneurial way of thinking, that drive to always be learning and growing and creating value, that's what makes a difference.
It's about taking charge of your career, looking for challenges, always learning new things. You got to be proactive and create your own opportunities.
Instead of just waiting for them to come to you.
Right. Being resourceful, resilient, especially in a world that's constantly changing.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's important to mention that, some people find Kiyosaki's ideas a bit controversial.
Yeah, he's definitely had his critics.
He's been accused of oversimplifying things or recommending strategies that some people see as risky.
Right. And we always say, do your own research. Talk to a trusted financial advisor. Think about your own risk tolerance before you make any big financial decisions.
Exactly. We're here to explore his ideas, not tell you what to do.
Right. But one thing that Rich Dad, Poor Dad does really well, it challenges the way we think about money. It pushes us to take control and create the financial future we want.
It's a great reminder that financial literacy is an ongoing journey, not a destination.
Absolutely.
There's always more to learn, more to discover, more to achieve.
And it's never too late to start. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final question to ponder.
What one step can you take today to start minding your own business, to start building that solid financial foundation?
It doesn't have to be anything huge. Maybe you finally create that budget you've been putting off. Open an investment account. Pick up a personal finance book.
Maybe you figure out what skills you want to develop and find a course or a mentor to help you. Remember, every journey starts with a single step.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you learned something valuable and that you're feeling inspired. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.